Right. Have we got right. So good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to go. Where's Doug? I did see Doug earlier.
Yeah, he was here.
He is here.
He's there.
We can't start without you, Doug, because we know where the first intervention comes from. So good morning, everyone, and welcome back. And thank you so much for a very good meeting yesterday. Lots of discussions. Everyone took part, made some excellent contributions and gave some good insights to the standard setting boards, which I know they appreciate. I'm sure today will be a repeat of yesterday, so thank you. And of course, I welcome our colleagues who are online. Again, thank you for taking the time. Some of you in different time zones, I know. The good thing is we won't be going so late today compared with yesterday, so you'll be able to have proper meals at hopefully the right time. So as we were able to accelerate our discussion on technology yesterday, we have finished with that. And we will start this morning with session 3, which is the future of audit and assurance firms. And I'm sure we'll have lots of discussion on that. We do have a breakout. We have 3 breakout groups, so 2 will be here. I think on your table, you've got the allocation. There's the green room and the orange room. And for those that are online, we've decided it will be much easier from a logistics point of view to put you in your own sort of breakout group. Sorry, that's probably the easiest way to do that. So that's what we've decided to do. So this morning we will receive an update, a brief update from the IASB's Firm Culture and Governance work stream. They'll be discussing this with us, the strategy when approaching the standard setting and non-standard setting initiatives on the topic. And we have also invited David Madden, who I mentioned yesterday, who's a director of IFAC, to come and present a paper that he took to the IFAC board in September. It's kind of background information. It's not authoritative. It's just to, the state of the nation, where it's going, where it's come from, where it might go, as relevant, I think, input to help us understand, the future potential firm models that we can then sort of give our views on in terms of risks, opportunities, etc. So with that, may I, unless there's anything from Tom or Gabriella? No, thank you. So then can I invite Jeff and Carla? Yep.
Yes, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Well, good afternoon and good evening for some of you as well, of course. And thank you for joining us on day 2 of our SAC meeting. So this morning and part of the afternoon, we will be going through session 3 with everyone. And like the other 2 sessions, we're essentially combining 2 connected topics. Part A, of course, if you can go to the next page, Diana. Part A is, of course, on our IASBA project or work stream, looking at firm culture and governance. You may recall that you provided some input to us back in April, and they've been really helpful and align actually really well with a lot of the comments that we have received from our other stakeholders and all our different meetings, in persons and virtual. So we'll just give you an overview just a little later in terms of where we're at and what we are intending to propose to our board, IASBA. And then we will ask you a couple of questions and get your strategic input on the next steps. And immediately after that, of course, we will look at the topic of private equity investments in accounting firms and the impact. And David Madden from IFAC, of course, will be presenting. And straight after that, we will have some breakout groups. And again, we want to hear your thoughts in terms of how your view and your understanding or your observations on how private equity investments might be impacting on accounting firms on a few areas, including their sort of organizational culture from an ethics perspective, how it, perhaps the tension between the firm's public interest responsibilities, how you think it might impact the audit quality management of the audit side of a firm. So we're looking forward to a great discussion there. So this first part of the session, we're going to talk to you about firm culture and governance. And I'm going to first pass to my colleague Carla, who's there with you in person. And she will just run through some of I'll give you some updates, and then I'll walk through with you what we will intending to present to our board in December with a final report and some of our recommendations. So Carla, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone. So before we go through a discussion, we would like to inform the members of the work we've done to date. I just need to make sure the slides work. 1 second. And the next slide, please. Since our last meeting in April, we've done quite an extensive work in reaching out to our key stakeholders. We've had over 40 meetings with a wide range of stakeholders, ranging from regulators, those charged with governance, independent non-executives, preparers, NSS, and also not to mention professional accounting organizations and also people from the firm as well. Those discussions were very enriching. And at the same time, we identified few common themes that came out, and you'll be hearing those themes as we go along with the presentation today. And on top of the discussions we had with stakeholders, we also commissioned an academic in terms of looking into what does the ethical culture look like, what it means, what research has been done to date so far, especially in terms of understanding how firms has progressed throughout the years when it's expanded into a multidisciplinary firms and it's gone in through various jurisdictions. Not surprising, some of the nuances that came out is very important for a leader to set the tone at the top, to be able to walk the talk. And those observations came out that mentioned that ethics and culture makes a DNA of a firm. It is something that we cannot ignore going forward as we look into this subject matter a bit further. We also reviewed the exempt provisions of the code to understand where we currently set in terms of addressing culture and governance issues. There are some parts in the code in section 100, 120, even part 2 and part 3, that speaks about leadership setting the tone in the organization and living and promoting ethical values within organization, the firm. It is very much ingrained in terms of the duty of a professional accountant in upholding public interests. That comes through very clearly, and we want to also then further explore what other parts of areas of the code that could be strengthened in terms of addressing issues of firm culture and governance. As part of this subject, we reviewed ISQM1. As some of you are aware, ISQM1 speaks to the culture and governance of a firm. In the audit context, there are some relevant requirements in ISQM1 that will be helpful as we explore this subject going further in the project. There is also in the market currently audit firm governance codes that exist in the UK and Japan. We spoke to UK FRC and we spoke to JFSA. Koichiro, thank you for speaking with us and give us a very in-depth discussion in terms of how the code is currently working in the various jurisdictions. Next slide, please. in the draft report that is already published on the ISPA site, which is a link is provided in the cover note that we've issued to SAC members. In agenda item 5A, we've identified 5 common themes that's come up from all the discussions. And the slide in front of it is summarized in a few bullet points above. As I mentioned before, the common feedback that was identified is senior leadership must set the tone for firm-wide ethical behavior and be able to demonstrate that. And what does that mean? It means having a governance framework and boosting up with a role in I&Es in terms of oversight and provide appropriate challenges to the decisions that the leadership will make during the course of carrying out various different business activities. How does that translate? We clearly need an accountability mechanism to be able to monitor and enforce such behavior without just making sure that it's not just a holistic approach. It is something that we be able to, the firms be able to monitor and enforce. One message that clearly came out is aligning rewards and incentives with the expected ethical behavior. It is not about when things goes wrong and you put measures in place to be able to curb those unethical behavior. It is also about rewarding positive ethical behavior that an individual in the firm has demonstrated throughout carrying out the performance at the firm. We spoke about the culture of speak up, being able to feel safe, to be able to voice concerns, opinions when they come across issues that's borderline crossing the ethical boundaries. But it is also about culture of consultation and challenge and being able to approach leadership or management when they have a concern on be able to voice out their concern and coming to a conclusion before they make a final decision. And the last point is the continuous ethics education and training that's essential, especially in circumstances when you're onboarding new staff or staff that don't normally come through a service line such as audit, where the ethics education is part and parcel of the education they receive at university. It may not be such circumstances for other non-audit services. Overall, to sum it up, stakeholders were very supportive of working group recommendations, and Jeff will talk you through in terms of the next step where the working group landed and our preliminary reviews in terms of taking this project further. Back to you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Carla, for that. We can move to the next slide, and the one after that, please. So the working group presented its preliminary report in September to the ISPA, to our board, and our board was also quite supportive of the 2 recommendations that I will walk through with you in just a minute. And what Carla just explained, those a few key points, they're not just stakeholders' views from Q3. In fact, they pretty much throughout our entire information gathering process. That's what we've heard from our stakeholders. And if you had a chance to review the working group's preliminary report, you see that those themes came up quite clearly. And there's a couple of others as well that I'll walk through in just a minute. But what I want to walk through with you firstly is in the report, we talk about the public interest issues. And of course, this is important for us to focus on because ultimately IASPA as a standard setting board, our mandate is to serve the public interest. So we need to identify what the issues we are looking at when we're looking at firm culture and governance. And what the working group has landed and discussed with the IASPA in September is that accounting firms have over the years cultivated a brand that is very much linked with a high level of professionalism, integrity, and of course public trust. And part of that is because traditionally, auditors in firms play a very important public interest function. But unethical behaviors, over a period of time, from all parts of the firm, not just audit failures, but from the entire firm, whatever services that they might provide, can really damage that trust. And you hear over the last few months or the last 12 months in my own home country in Australia, cheating, exams cheating all across different jurisdictions. They all have an impact in terms of public trust and public confidence on firms. And part of that, we see that there's, of course, a growth in quite a rapid growth, in fact, in recent years in consulting services in firms, in accounting firms. Now, that itself is not a bad thing, and that is, in fact, not what the board is saying. That growth in consulting services itself is a bad thing. It's a business. Accounting firms are businesses, and I think it's great that accounting firms are able to continue to grow the business, find new business opportunities, and grow into different areas. But it does carry with them significant public interest. Because public interest, yes, with audit, there is a significant public interest because of the role of audit. But in consulting areas and in a lot of other areas, it's also regulated. For instance, in tax planning, tax advice, these are significant areas. But also sometimes in strategic consulting as well. Potentially, for instance, a firm could be consulting the public sector on major infrastructure development or on major policies like tax policies, for instance. These have significant public interest elements attached to them. And therefore, ethical failures will impact that public trust. And of course, as Khaled mentioned earlier, from our information gathering from different stakeholders, our own research, and from the academic reports, there is very clear connection between the ethical culture or the ethical environment within a firm to ethical behavior. A strong ethical culture will provide the environment for a high-level ethical behavior of its employees. And when it comes to culture, the next time we're gonna talk about in terms of the impact of culture. What are some of the key factors? So when firms have the right culture, when they have the right leadership, when they have the right governance, we believe that firms will operate as highly ethical firms. And as a result, it will help mitigate some of the risk associated with unethical behavior. And that's why it's so important that for us as a global center set on ethics to look at culture, to look at governance and leadership. So if I can go to the next slide. So when we're looking at these public interest issues and in terms of unethical behavior and the impact of culture, it became clear to the working group that strong ethical culture, as I mentioned earlier, will mitigate the risk of unethical behavior and help enhance a firm's reputation. And we've identified two key factors that really influence ethical culture. The first one is ethical leadership. That is leadership who really prioritizes ethical values. That in their strategies they will and in their messaging they will really put ethical values in there. They'll take into account ethical considerations. And, as Carlos mentioned, the tone from the top, but it's more than just that tone from the top. It's about the actions, about the decisions. What leaders pay attention to and how they react to ethical issues, for instance, ethical failures, how quickly they react to them and whether they are responding appropriately, all make a difference. All tells your staff what are the important things to this firm from an ethics perspective. The other key influencing factor on culture that the working group has concluded is on governance, having the right governance framework. And of course, that includes oversight, that includes the governance structures. Of course, leadership needs to have the ultimate responsibility in setting the culture of the firm. That means that they need to be accountable. That means that they need to have regular monitoring, assessing, and ways to improve the culture and ways to improve the governance systems to make sure that it has a right ethical culture. We also look at, of course, the responsibility and the relationship between the global leadership and the local leadership when it comes to global network firms. But the working group is also looking broader than that, beyond the traditional, perhaps what we would call governance. So beyond just oversight and the leadership structure. We also look at some of the other measures, including, for instance, we have listed here a few, the independent non-executives. This is, of course, mandated in the UK with the UK FRC Audit Firm Governance Code for those who audit over a number of public interest entities. And in Japan as well, the Audit Firm Governance Code also require that if you audit any pies. That really the concept of I&Es really helps to give that sort of independent input to the leadership of the firm. We've mentioned about accountability mechanism, not just for leadership, but for the whole firm. I think that's a point that came up very clear, particularly in our September board meeting. And accountability, of course, is tied very much to performance management, to rewards and incentives, and having that non-financial performance metrics. But it's more than just about non-financial performance metrics. It needs to have a way to measure the staff's ethical performance. And another point that the working group has identified here is, apart from incentive structures, firms also need to look at disincentive structures. That means when there's ethical failures, there needs to be a very clear sense of consequences and what would happen when you do, have ethical failures within the firms. And the other point, of course, is public disclosure of ethical performance and transparency. But the working group is also seeing that this is more than just, a transparency reporting. It is also about having that open dialogue with regulators, open dialogue with other stakeholders, for instance, investors, those chartered governance groups, and to understand and to hear their concerns and to act accordingly and to react accordingly. Some of the other ones that Carla has already mentioned is cultural consultation, the challenge, and education and training. So with that, that is kind of what the working group, in a nutshell, the findings, the key points. And so I'm going to walk you through in the next few minutes just on the working group's recommendations. We can turn to the next slide. So there are two key recommendations that the working group has presented to the board in September, and the board was generally supportive. And as you've heard from Carla, we have presented these to our stakeholders as well, and they're generally quite supportive of these two recommendations. The first one is a standard setting project. And the goal of this project, what the working group is proposing is essentially to set some new standards relating to firm culture and governance that will allow firm to function as highly ethical firms and therefore to mitigate risk of unethical behavior. Now, it's very important that I touch on the scope here, that this is not just on the audit line of the business or on the behavior of auditors or the culture of the audit department or an audit firm. It's about all service lines. So If it's a multidisciplinary firm, it's about all the service lines, audit, consulting, tax, all those areas. Because we believe that it would only work if you have a whole of firm approach and you have a whole of firm governance and framework and leadership that really focus and prioritize ethical values. It will be principles based, and we need to bear in mind that we need to have the flexibility to allow firms, allow jurisdiction to adapt to what works for them and is what relevant for them in the jurisdiction and in the firms as well. And of course, it needs to be very much scalable. We understand that the structures of a large global network firm would be very much different to say in S&P, maybe with 2 or 3 partners. So we need to make sure that the standards that we're proposing will be scalable. And then as part of this project, we are proposing to develop a framework that addresses leadership and governance and some of the other areas that we mentioned earlier that will promote ethical firm culture. And we've talked about these already. And the one key point, of course, is as you would know and appreciate that RWSB already has the ISQM1, it's already effective. And so we would work very closely with our colleague on the RWSB side to make sure that there is full alignment, that we will complement, that our standard will complement what what the ISQM1 is doing in terms of looking at having that system of quality management. Of course, they have one component on governance and leadership. They have another component of relevant ethical requirements, and these all impact firms as well in terms of their culture. And so we will work quite closely with our colleague at RWSB in relation to our connectivity with ISQ11. If I can turn to the next slide. The other recommendations is that we would recommend that we develop, or the board develops, non-authoritative materials or guidance material that will also complement the standard setting project. One of the topics that we're looking at is roles and responsibilities and raising awareness of those of the key players within the ecosystem, regulators, other standard setters, investors, those chartered governance and professional accountancy organizations, and this essentially recognizing the fact that there is an ecosystem out there, whilst firms have ultimate responsibility in terms of managing their own culture. Other players who will have a role to play as well. Guidance materials are helpful, and many of our stakeholders very much welcome the opportunity for us to develop these standards because, we can, as you would appreciate, the standard setting process does take a little bit longer to get through. But with this guidance material, we can get it out to the marketplace a bit sooner. They will be complementary to the proposed standard setting project, but they will also help to really promote the importance of firm culture and governance when it comes to ethical behavior, when it comes to helping firms to really develop and maintain and enhance the public trust. And so over the course of the next stage, I guess in 2025, we would look at developing a whole range of other guidance material as well. And there could be thought pieces, articles, and we could do that in partnership with other stakeholders as well. So in a nutshell, that's what the working group has got to in terms of its findings and presentations. As I mentioned, the board in September was quite receptive and supportive of the working group's findings and also the 2 recommendations. So we want to now hear from you, so we could turn to the next slide. We do have 2 questions for you this morning. And the first one is relating to, I guess, in terms of completeness of our approach. So it's at a strategic level, of course, besides ethical leadership and governance, and governance in a broader sense, some of those systems and mechanisms that we've discussed. Are there any other dimensions that also have a substantive impact on the firm's ethical culture? And so this is very much about completeness. And as some of you would appreciate that in terms of our standard setting work is very much governed by the public interest framework. And one of the characteristics of standard setting is that is completeness, that it needs to be complete. So that's one strategic, I suppose, area that we want to get your input on. The other question from the perspectives of investors, users, or from the profession, what specific challenges or risks do you foresee in the implementation of the working group's two recommendations, the standard setting and the NAMs, and how can these challenges or risks be mitigated to ensure success in implementing the recommendations? This also associated with another characteristics of a standard in the public interest framework, and it's about implementability and ability of being consistently applied and globally operable. So we want to hear your thoughts on this aspect as well. So Alan, I will pass it to you. I would suggest that perhaps we'll just open the floor for both these questions at the same time. So SAC members can maybe answer one or both questions at the same time, and very much looking forward to your feedback. So back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Carla. Very comprehensive, and clearly a lot of work has been done since we had the discussions earlier this year. So we got two questions. Can I just maybe start off with a question to you? We talk about public interest a lot, and it's a very sort of compelling phrase, isn't it, to say you work in the public interest. But do you think there's a common understanding, and indeed maybe a common definition of what that means right across our profession? I know we're dealing with firms here today, but my question also, I think, be relevant for those professional accountants working in business and in the public sector. Maybe the public sector professional accountants might sort of relate much more to the public interest requirement. But do you think in your discussions over the years that there is a sort of clear understanding of what that means? And if I were to go into a sort of an audit firm sort of down the road and sort of say, why do you do your job? Will the answer be, I do it because I'm protecting the public interest?
Thank you. I guess I'll answer it first before we get to the other questions. I think that's a very good question. It's certainly a very difficult question to answer as well, because I think if it's an easy answer, there would have been I think a definition out there. So there is no definition in that sense. But I think when we look at public interest, obviously broadly you have the whole public as well. But I think it really also depends on the circumstances, on the case. So depending on, for instance, if a firm is providing input to say to the government on tax advice, for instance, then very much I would say the public interest is not just the interest of the department, perhaps, that you're providing advice to, but also very much the public at all, because it is the taxpayers' funds who pay for these services, and also the advice could impact on whatever they're giving advice to. For instance, if it's tax advisory or tax policies, for instance, that could very much impact the entire public. So I think it does depend to an extent on its situation, and it varies perhaps. But I think it's very much we need to look at certainly the investors group. We need to look at those chartered governance. We need to look at to an extent the employees as well of the firms. So I think it's multifaceted. It's very hard to just sort of pin down to one specific answer. If you look at audit, for instance, of course, their work will very much impact market confidence. So again, there, there you could argue that it's very broad understanding of what a public could be. So I think it really varies from situation to situation there.
Thanks, Jeff. I mean, there may be something about doing some more work on this as a profession, because I do believe that it's actually an attractive calling card for, recruitment, retention, going forward, if we can actually encourage people to want to work in our profession, because we are one of the few that really is a public interest profession. And I think we really need to dial up and enhance that. Anyway, so I don't want to take too much time.
If I could just add one,
I think about all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could add one point here, Alan, I think what you just said really, it's a really important point. And perhaps I've missed one really key point in our presentations just then, is that whilst, firms sometimes might see the public interest as a bit of a burden, as a bit of a compliance thing, but we don't see it that way. We see that ethics and public interest really is a value proposition for firms. It's an opportunity for them to say that they provide not just good technical services, but services that comes with a high level of trust. And we think that this is really give firms a competitive edge. It is a value proposition, and I think firms should see it, and the professions should see it as a positive thing, as a good thing. Whilst we try to get to, perhaps give better boundaries of what that means, but I think general attitude can be, it is a great thing to have this over perhaps other professions that don't perhaps have this particular mandate on public interest. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Jeff. Right, so I'm going to shut up and open it up, and guess what? The first question. Doug, thank you.
I couldn't help myself, and apologies to Jeff Carler and Chana, who's not here, because I've already sent comments to them last Friday. Interesting enough, firstly, I was going to say congratulations on the project, and Gabriella as well. It's a very important project, being well introduced. It's important at any time, but in the current environment, including in Australia, with current events, it's even more important if that's possible. Now, interestingly enough, my first point was actually about the public interest. So I'm glad you raised that, because, and Jeff raised the public interest, so it's not being ignored, but the papers actually start off talking about trust and reputational risk, which I think is important to think about. But I agree, the mindset through the papers should start with the public interest, because that's the mindset that people throughout the firm should have. Now, I hadn't thought about the definition more recently, but two things happened. There was an exposure draft about public interest, which I think went nowhere. I can't remember which year, because it was a very difficult project. But also with the monitoring group reforms, of course, we have the public interest framework. And so I agree with Jeff, it's sort of a context-specific thing, but particularly the public interest framework had a particular focus on how can I put it? Certainly from a securities regulator point of view, it was investors, confident and informed markets. I know it went further because it covered prudential aspects as well. But I think you've raised an important point. I think there needs to be more done on public interest, but you also wouldn't want to slow down the project, given it's quite a difficult area. I guess I'll also add that, in a sense, public interest might be growing because of some of these things about social licenses and all of those sorts of things. That wasn't actually my main point, but also I thought somewhere the fundamental principles which are in the code need to be sort of brought into this as well. And I'll just keep talking until someone stops me, by the way, but on the non-authoritative materials, I think that's really important, but I think, and Jeff sort of touched on this, there's a sort of a third part after the non-authoritative materials, which is working with others in the ecosystem, and more than perhaps just articles. And it does go to some of the constraints that Jeff touched on. So, and something we talked about in some different areas yesterday, but it goes to how national standard setters operate and their authority and so forth. And so I'm conscious that this is, a lot of this is about firms and firm leadership. It's not just about everyone in the firm. And that can be a difficulty because, local laws and the ability of accounting bodies might go to individuals rather than firms. And so that's something that probably needs to be thought about at a national level, how to resolve that, as well as a question about applying this to the full range of service lines within a firm. Maybe that's a little bit easier within firms, but then the next part, which I'm not sure whether Jeff touched on, is you want a level playing field, and these services go beyond the firms. So, you've got similar consulting services, but offered by bodies that aren't actually accounting firms. So, that's why this needs to be considered, as well at a national level and, the authority and so forth. So also internationally, there's a big role to be played, not just by the leadership within national firms, but also globally within the international firms, particularly the larger firms that have the networks. Goes a bit to the command and control model. And so perhaps some thought needs to be given to some guidance around that, but ultimately how, and maybe it's something for IFU and the Global Audit Quality Working Group, but how this can be operationalised through the things like, it's sort of like a supervisory college. Also, and I mentioned this in a different context yesterday, but ISCO has a guide for audit committees, and there may be some things that can be perhaps weaved into that. Sorry, I'm coding more work for everyone, but apologies if they're interested, of course. But also at the ISCO sort of board level, and perhaps the IFIA board level as well, both organisations have principles, and for regulation, admittedly it's mainly, I'm thinking about the audit side, but it's more than that in securities regulation. And those principles should be thought about the extent to which, and I was thinking of examples which are admittedly one's audit oriented, but the monitoring function, and there's some good IFIA principles, but not to the extent of the audit inspections, and Jeff will understand why I'm raising that, because there's something specific in the Australian context around that. But it also perhaps goes to principles that maybe, and this will be controversial, you want legally enforceable ethical standards in jurisdictions as well, and perhaps independent standard setters, backed by government to make those standards. So I know that exists in some jurisdictions, but not others. Principles versus rules, but we didn't really touch on that, but it's already there in the Code of Ethics, an issue that it's a little bit like you want principles to work well for things like recognition and measurement in financial reports, but not disclosure. And they sort of work and don't work for ethics. You need a combination of principles and rules. Rules are sort of the minimum, but you want to make sure that people step back and think about the principles. And this is going to be very relevant when it comes to firm culture and governance as well. So I thought I'd mention that. ISQM1. I was thinking about ISQM1 a little bit differently from the working group, but I'm glad they are thinking about it. Rather than, perhaps this is a difficult one because it crosses over both boards, but and I appreciate ISQM1 is at the moment about audit quality, and that's not disconnected with firm governance and culture, but there are a lot of themes and so forth. And the question comes to my mind, rather than trying to align, whether ISQM1 should actually be expanded out to all of the service lines of the firms. And in a sense, that's been done in Australia by the APSB. And anyway, perhaps I may not go into more detail on Australia, but something to be thought about because there's a lot of good material there, but it might also mean to some extent reviewing ISQM1 in the context of this project as well, whether it in itself can be enhanced, subject to, of course, all the other work priorities of the IAASB as well. I'm very good at creating work today. So root causes, and I'm almost finished, by the way, on my initial thoughts, so you'll be pleased to know. But root causes, yeah, and this perhaps goes a little bit to question one. There are a whole lot of root causes, and they were discussed, at the last SAC meeting in the breakout sessions. And I know it's not always easy, but maybe to make sure we've got all the solutions in a sense, the root causes should be mapped to the solutions as far as they can be. And I've got a long list of root causes, but I won't go through all those. And the other thing is, and again, this might be controversial, thinking about other solutions beyond what's in the working group papers. And I mentioned that, and it goes back to something we touched on yesterday, for example, long associations. You might end up saying, well, it's just, the appropriate answer is about partner rotation and key people on the team, and not firm rotation as an example. And I keep rotating, apologies, back to audit. But maybe it's something that does need to be addressed in the context of this project, because questions will be asked about those areas they are in Australia. And so it might be you go through it and come to the answer not to do anything, but it's probably something that in some areas would be expectations that's thought about.
Doug, I think I'm going to have to.
Yes, I'm stopping. That's actually, I'm finished, which is good. Good.
But really, thank you very much for kicking off. A lot of thinking clearly has gone into this, and as you said, you've already written to Jeff, so I'm sure he's taken on board a lot of what you said, and thanks for kicking it off. And thanks for responding on the public interest mindset issue, which I feel very strongly about, as like you do. Right. So let's. I think we got Natasha. I understand is online, although
Yes,
I
thanks.
don't.
Can you hear
No,
me?
I don't. Yeah, we can't see on the screen, but I
Yeah,
was told that you.
I have to apologize.
That's okay.
My camera's not working.
Yes. Okay.
But hopefully, if you can hear me,
Yes,
I
we
will
can
try.
loudly. Thank you.
I will try and be brief and hopefully not too loud. So look, I really welcome this work, but I am going to make a couple of what I think are probably quite challenging observations, which are somewhat direct. First of all, linked to my comment yesterday, I struggle with this concept that we're separating ethics and good governance from the core standards. I think this makes it feel like it's optional, secondary, and yet this is absolutely core to high quality audit. That's my first point. My second point is that I feel somewhat that we're dancing around the elephant in the room here, which is that we need to see a fundamental shift in financial incentives. We're not going to achieve high quality ethics and governance, in my view, through the imposition of standards where the core incentive structure is driving all the wrong behaviors. And I am, I'm not saying all audits are problematic, etc., but there is a fundamental flaw with regards to conflicts of interest within the model that we have today. And in my view, really, we need to see a profound shift in establishing transparent and meaningful accountability to shareholders so that we see mandates only being awarded or retained when high quality audits are delivered. And that would then align the financial incentives, and then the whole need for having this incredible construct of ethics and standards and detailed kind of codes starts to fall away because the incentives are aligned. Just finally, very briefly on your point on the public interest, I also think this is worth fleshing out, but from our perspective, I would say there's often the investor interest is equated with the public interest. So we talk about sort of interchangeably audit for investors and audit for the public. I don't think it's the same thing, but I do think they come pretty close to being the same thing when you're talking about long-term investors. I don't think short-term investors necessarily have an interest in robustly independent audit that supports efficient capital market allocation, which I think is at the heart of what audit is all about. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. David?
Thank you, and thank you, Jeff, and your comments. First, I fully agree on your preliminary recommendations. Full stop. Like everything you said was fantastic. I am concerned about the technology discussion. I want to link it to this. I will argue that the ethical behavior of culture and accountability has shifted, and a lot of the shift has occurred because of technology. When it's used as a decision maker and not a tool, as it should be, I think technology accelerates unethical behavior. It weakens appropriate human behavior. And many examples exist in social media. So we have an environment where we're moving faster. I don't think we're naturally becoming unethical, but the tools and the coldness of technology between the decision makers. So it's not my fault something went wrong. The tool said this, and therefore I take a step back from taking accountability for something that went wrong because the tool forced this bad audit to happen. It's the tool's fault. It's somebody else's fault. I hate those words. You don't take ownership for something that went wrong. You should. And so as a result, we need to bring some of these ethical decision-making points into technology, back into yesterday's discussion. We have to have ethical decision-making points in technology in order for it to be used properly in an audit, in an assurance, in anything. And it's just touching, I know I'm going over my time limit, but just touching on what Natasha said, she's right. I've been in this business for 30 years as an auditor, a preparer, regulator. The business model has shifted. I watched it shift underneath my feet. The recruitment process has shifted, the training has shifted, and the ethical behavior has shifted with it. We're getting faster, more productive. However, we were losing something. And once we lose that public trust, what's the point of doing an assurance engagement? There's a lot of people who argue there is no point of doing insurance engagement. Just have a computer plug into the company's financial statements. It will rerun all the transactions in overnight and give you what the financial statement should look like regardless. We could get to that point. I hear people say, what's the point? And I argue we are doing something that brings public trust to the financial statements. And if the stakeholders don't feel it, we're losing our audience. We're losing our customer. We're losing our role. And I'll leave it there. And thank you very much, Jeff. Love your work.
Thank you, David. So can I just, so everyone, if we're just conscious of time, so try to keep it brief, and if it's already been said, of course, no need to repeat it. But let me come into the room. Toshimitsu, please.
Thank you, Jeff and team, for this great achievement. Regarding the question number one, I am sorry for giving this extreme opinion, but my answer is that current business model, meaning issuer, preparer, pay model, is the one. As I said in the breakout session.
Sorry, is what? Wrong. Okay.
Other one is a dimension. As I said in the breakout session of the last SAC meeting, I have always thought current issuer preparer pay model has too many problems in terms of conflict of interest. This issue is quite similar to the problem of analyst report and credit rating. So I rather prefer user investor pay model than current one, because the true client of auditors is investor users. Thank you.
Thank you. Jose?
Thank you. Just talking, I want to ask a question to Jeff, but first of all, by the way, I found a definition of public interest, which was made by IFAC in June 2012. Maybe you should revise it, and because it's a very, very long definition, and and it's a very important topic. My question to Jeff, I agree with what you presented, but I don't understand, and maybe you please work more about what you mean by transparency about ethical performance.
Jeff, are you able to take that quickly?
Yes, sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. Thank you for that question. I suppose we are looking at, for instance, we don't have necessarily a concrete list of things that firms need to disclose that we feel that they need to have, and it's not necessarily we will go to that level of details, of course. But the working group in looking at different practices in different jurisdictions, we would, we've looked at things like they would discuss, for instance, their I&Es in terms of the appointment of I&Es, who's on it. We have looked at, for instance, whether they would disclose any sort of ethical failures within the firms and how they address them. So I think those are kind of some of the things that we are looking at. We don't have, like I said, a list yet. And this is something that perhaps the moving to the next step, the next stage, and the next phase that the project team will be looking at in terms of what it means to be able to demonstrate how a firm, and indeed at the staff and individual level, what that means to demonstrate that you have behaved ethically, collectively as a firm, but also individually as staff. So that's something that we will explore perhaps more in the next phase.
Thank you. Claes, please.
Yes, thank you. Very short. I think this is it's a class. The answer to question 2 is a classical conflict of interest issue, of course, between who's paying the auditors and what the auditors do. And coming to question 1, I think the core issue for me would be the rewarded incentives in the firm, because that's something the firm can control and also monitor by itself within the audit firm. So that's a key point, I think, here in order to mitigate this conflict of interest, and having the right incentives, right reward systems, and also follow up on lack of compliance to that. The other one is transparency. I think there is a strong need for transparency regarding what the audit firms do on this, and also there is a role for regulators, of course, to also play in this in making sure that whatever principles are in place that are followed.
Thank you, Claes. Monica, I saw your hand up earlier. Have you taken it down?
Yeah, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Just a brief comment. Basically, on question 1, it's what is it was mentioned in conflict of interest, and also what might be impacting is the lack of control by the local authorities, because when there's appropriate control for a profession, for the business, the risk on breaking the ethical culture is reduced. But anyway, when we think on challenges or risks, I personally don't see major ones considering conceptually, because this is something that already applied. And it was positive to hear during the presentation that the scalability is being already addressed, because this will be key considering the different sizes and characteristics of the firms. Thank you.
Thank you. Nikos?
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What I see is that just like a listed entity on a stock exchange, lots of competent authorities have imposed corporate governance rules on listed companies. So there's no to avoid any, lack of bad financial statements or whatever in the company. So looking at the papers provided, which I couldn't agree more with, and with proposals, and I want to thank the working group for the excellent work. I see in the paper that the factors influencing the ethical and leadership governance, which is the independence and non-executives, which is, I think, one of the biggest, just like a listed company, there you have to have someone that can, express his opinion on the board and say something, because if it's all auditors on the board, you won't get a biased opinion. Okay, so that is, I think, one of the great factors, and the accountability mechanism, which I think in ISQM 1, when you have to have the risk assessment made by the audit firm, they have to make the risk assessment process and identify all quality objectives and meeting those objectives. And one of those are the governance and leadership. So it's up to the firm to have a good accountability mechanism, which is part of the ISQM 1, which is risk assessment. And audit regulators, that's what they do. That's their job, to go and see if the firms comply with these worldwide standards, with the ISQM 1 and 2. So it's important, and I couldn't agree more with these two, because these are the governing bodies of an audit firm, play a good role. And in United Kingdom and Japan that have introduced the governance codes, I think that is very excellent. It's a good idea. So you cannot impose it, but they can do voluntary governance codes, and I think that's where it starts. Just like listed companies, that's the most important thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. I can't see Nana, but I understand she has her hand up. Are you there, Nana?
Yes, sorry, my camera is not that's
okay, no problem. Thanks.
Yeah. So I just want to say I fully agree with Natasha mentioned, and also the second speaker. And on the strategic level ethic culture question, the first one, I just want to say something else we noticed in our research is that also the relationship of the workers in the company, the labor relationship is also very important. So companies that has been seeing the news, like negative news around the union or the labor's issues, has been very positively related to poor performance, I think, on the stocks and also on the company value in the longer term. Thank you.
Thanks. Sue.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I struggle with this one too, but maybe from a different angle or perspective. And I advise caution proceeding, and candidly, maybe start with non-authoritative guidance without a standard setting companion or component. First, I'm not sure really what we're trying to solve for that isn't already in the code by way of principles or the conceptual framework. That might be better addressed through guidance and examples of how to have a high ethical culture, because every firm is going to be different based on their practice and how practices are growing. And it's the kind of thing like I'd see how that works first before going into a more formal standard setting process. And part of my struggle lies, Jeff, in what you said around, whatever is done in the standard setting space being principles based and scalable. But the items, or some of the items that you listed, I think it was on slide 9, are actually very prescriptive and are not principles, nor are they scalable, like disclosure and transparency about ethical performance and independent non-executives. Again, I'd exercise caution. And I do worry a bit in this space that we may go too far. And I really say this because of what we're starting to see happen within the United States with audits of listed entities as things like this become more and more prescriptive. And it is actually having the effect of resulting in mid-size firms getting out of the public company audit practice. And these are really good quality firms that serve small to mid-sized listed entities and pies, but the burdens are becoming so huge that it's just not worth it at some point. And that is not in the public interest. And Alan, you went down the path of saying, what is the public interest? How are we thinking about the public interest? Well, having enough firms to do this work and committed to high quality is super important. And if you don't have those firms, that's not in the public interest either. So I know this is from a very different angle, but I just advise caution. And again, my recommendation would be start with guidance, right? Start helping practitioners understand what does ethical look like, this type of ethics look like within the context of how they've structured their firms. And that might be enough because we already have principles in place.
Thank you, Sue. All perspectives are needed, so the fact that it might be slightly from a different angle doesn't matter at all. So thank you very much. Can I just do a quick time check? Linda, what time have we agreed with David? Because I obviously don't want to keep him if he's got other things to do.
Yeah, he's online right now, so we could go to 10:30.
We can go to 10:30, and he's okay with that. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for that break. Isabel?
Yes, thank you very much. I think I commend the work of the working group. It was really very interesting. So David used the word taking responsibility, which triggered my requesting the floor, because one of the dimensions which can be unhelpful would be a legal environment. And the reason I say that is I've seen in the context of the Wirecard case that the auditors were able to no longer be tried by the audit regulator because they just rescinded their license. So, I have a driver's license. I maim somebody. I hand over my license. I hand it back, and I say, not going to drive a car again. So I'm not responsible. So sometimes we may also need to look at other exogenous reasons which may also have a bearing on the ethical culture at the firm or on the individual. And the other point that I wanted to mention, and it's not specific to audit firms or what is I've often heard in organizations, oh, the tone at the top. We have zero tolerance for this, for that. What I've very rarely seen is how then do you report that back transparently to staff? So say you have the speak up mechanisms or you have the whistleblowing mechanisms. When the staff actually get any statistics on there were X whistleblowing messages, we handled these and in that way. So it's also one thing to do that vis-a-vis the investors and the general public, but if you want to have an impact on your own firm's culture and you actually need to demonstrate what the tone at the top is, what are the results, and I've failed to see that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I'll come back into the room. Steve?
Thank you, Alan. So Jeff and Carlo, this is very, very good work. Thank you, and such a difficult area to tackle. You mentioned training and education, enhancing that in some of your recommendations. My observation from a client perspective is the following question: how effective is training and education for our auditors? Several years ago, there was a high-profile cheating scandal at a large accounting firm. There was media exposure, PCAOB fines, cheating on training modules. At the time, at a former organization, I was a client. And while the occurrence itself was deeply disappointing, the firm reaction at a very senior management level was kind of equally disappointing in terms of, rationalization, efforts to remediate. It definitely impacted the trust at the time from a client perspective. And by the way, I am not claiming to have the answer on how to design effective training and education programs. We have all been inundated with countless compliance training requests. I too have received many threatening emails in the past that I was deficient in some of my requirements too, and I had to get on it. But I'm really, really hopeful there's a better way to train and educate auditors to better serve the public interest.
Thanks, Steve. Conchita, good evening. You're on mute, I think. We can't hear you, Conchita. No, still mute.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate very much the work that has been done by your group, Job. And I appreciate the note there saying shorter timeline. That's very good. What you have done is, I would say, a great work. And on the questions raised, I would say covering ethical leadership and governance is huge enough an area to cover. There may be other dimensions, but I believe on the saying that the tone from the top is key to a lot of endeavors of the corporation or the entity. As far as the foreseeable challenges or risks that may be foreseen in the implementation of the two recommendations, the fact that you are raising this is indicative of your anticipation that there will be challenges. And to say what those challenges are may be, so to speak, predicting when in fact it's only when you do it or roll it out that you will be able to identify what are substantive and what are probably not so important. So I believe that your team, your technical working groups are equipped to do what you intend to roll out, and I wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. Abdelila, assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon to you.
Alaikum salam. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Well, I mean, I just want to very quick comment, which is perhaps more prevalent for like emerging or developing markets. It's the institutional framework challenges, which may impact the ethical culture implementation. I think 2 points. The first is on regulatory systems, where in some cases there is a fragmentation of the regulatory frameworks, which creates complexity, operational complexity. And there could be then challenges of inconsistent interpretations of standards, even within the same jurisdiction. To add to it, the frequent and potential regulatory changes and uncertainty that creates environments where maintaining consistent ethical practices may be in cases challenging. And I think the second point, which is related to this one also, is which is also very important, is on the enforcement capability gap. While I mean, regulatory frameworks may exist on paper in some cases, but practical implementation may face significant resources and expertise constraints. So there could be an enforcement expectation gap where I mean, one must maintain high ethical standards in environments where local enforcement mechanisms may not provide adequate support or guidance. I mean, these are just some observations, though I must acknowledge that I'm not certain how these challenges could be effectively addressed in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hilda.
Thank you. Good morning. When I think about what especially is proposed in the standard setting project, in order for this at the end, when this is developed to be a success, I think it's potentially necessary to have, regulatory support to actually have those changes put in place, or even changes in the law, or at least to have the absolute senior management leadership of firms to agree and to work with them upfront to actually gauge their willingness to be open to change and to take those on. Maybe you have done this, but I think without that, I think you have to think about, how effective can we be to actually have any change seen in practice. And, when, for instance, on question 1, I think Klaas gave very good suggestions. I think like ownership of the firms, not only PE ownership, but ownership in general is very important, because that's where the shots are being called. And so, for instance, there was reference to Japan and the UK as having made some changes. In Europe, we also look at the Netherlands, where I think they have done certain things comparable to what happened in the UK. I don't know for Japan, I have to admit. But I think in the UK, you focused much more on public interest entity firms. And so here it seems to be all over the place. So I'm not entirely sure if I fully understand why you don't want to do it in phases and start with the top firms and then go down. And I don't know if in the UK you have made an evaluation of how successful the changes are. Maybe it's too new. If I look at the Netherlands, unfortunately, and a reference was made to exam cheating in the US, there is, unfortunately, and it's all in the public domain, a lot of exam cheating that is being reported in the Netherlands. And in one of the cases, in one of the big four, the non-executive directors, independent non-executives, as you call them, they were, if not else, they were aware, or they didn't take any action, or they were involved. And so if you then read this in the newspaper, you're thinking, okay, what can you achieve? So what is it that you need to do in addition to that to have, real change? And when I read this, I think I wasn't sure anymore if, what you're proposing actually can be effective, because it very much depends on individuals, and all individuals make mistakes, hopefully not that big mistakes, but sooner or later that happens. So how do you cater for this? For me, it's an open question. I find this actually very, very difficult.
Thank you, Hilda. Koichiro?
Thank you very much. We strongly support the initiative, and we think that the scope is comprehensive. And one aspect we really want to emphasize is all service lines are covered. That's really important. Not only auditing division, but also other service lines. It's a really important area. Of course, it's challenging at the same time. We really support the direction. And as Hilda mentioned right now, the individual's value and awareness, that is the important aspect, and that is the challenging aspect. So we have to keep in mind not only form, but also substance we really have to pursue. So just, DVD training and check mark, that's not sufficient. How to achieve the substance of the culture and the governance, that's really challenging at the same time. That's really important. And the same thing can be said to the transparency to investors. So transparency report might be one avenue. And the important thing is how to achieve the transparency of the substance of the culture and the governance, instead of just the advertising document of the culture and the governance. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Vasiliki?
Thank you. I'll just keep it brief. I just want to say I'm fully supportive of what Sue said. While we very much agree with the themes that were discussed. We're not entirely sure that a standard would solve it, and perhaps guidance is what's needed in the short term. I think what is a little bit worrying is the short time frame as well to get something out, and there is a bit of a concern that we rush it out and giving all the strong views and how many stakeholders, and when we start talking about regulatory changes, that's not going to happen in the short amount of time. And it's very important to guard against a poor quality standard coming out that actually is unenforceable and unworkable, because that'll really make adoption of it come into question, and that's exactly the last thing we need. So I think that's the just in summary, in addition to what was said.
Thanks, Vasiliki. Javier?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think I want to congratulate the team, because I think the presentation was good, addressing the points being very specific, and I would say tangible, giving us I'm an investor here. Having said that, I think that I want to introduce an element here. I think that the situation is not the same for even there are global standards in every country, in every culture. There's an element of culture here with ethical behavior and also with the ethical behavior. And in that sense, I think that it's very important that the incentives, the expectations of the people engaged on a day-to-day basis on doing the auditing, they are aligned with the top management, because the top management usually, they have these things in place and they know what it is, but doesn't mean necessarily that they're implementing. I mean, I'm not to take a specific case I saw in my professional life where I was completely, they were not aligned, the two things, and that's really what happened. So I think that this is an element that has to be taken into consideration here. So that even there are global standards, I think the incentives have to be aligned with the ethical behavior of the in this case of the auditing firms.
Javier, Hina?
Thank you. I agree that the firm's culture is closely connected with the upcoming private equity investment discussion we are going to have. And I feel that has a great influence it has on the day-to-day affairs of the firm, as well as maintaining its culture. We can't disconnect each one of them with each other. Secondly, I agree that the working group's recommendations, and with a view that can also consider a situation where a firm with a strong ethical culture breaches trust and is penalized by the regulator. So what impression the firm, this framework may also consider the impression such breaches will leave on the firm in future. So it's important that unethical instances impact the firm's ethical standing and how this could be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Hina. Nicole?
Yeah, two brief observations. The first one with regard to the first recommendation that was made. At least I believe that the wording in this recommendation should be changed, because if I understand it correctly, you're not talking about an ethical governance framework, rather you're talking about an ethical culture framework in which governance and leadership and others, like we heard in the discussion, tone at the top, incentives and so on and so forth, are important factors. So analog to the structure of the IAASB framework of audit quality. So the main thing is ethical culture, and then you are developing attributes that contribute to an ethical culture. So I think the wording should be changed in this recommendation. And the second observation I do have relates to slide 9 of your presentation. And it was mentioned now several times, the non-executive directors. I understand that perfectly, but I believe what you had in mind was the one-tier corporate governance system when you were talking about this measure. And when we are looking at a two-tier corporate governance system, for instance, what we have in Germany, and a firm operates under the legal form of a German Aktiengesellschaft, so listed company. You have a supervisory board and a management board, and in the management board, by definition, you do have only executives. So just keeping this in mind when suggesting measures as a minor comment. Thank you.
I don't see any more. Oh, sorry, George.
Thank you, Alan. I'm going to be very quick, very targeted comment, and this is on the substance over form issue. In my work, we do a lot of coverage on governance, and what we have found is that it's quite easy to get the structures in place, but actually getting the practice to change is the bigger problem, right? And so I think as we work through this, I'm seeing recommendations to have independent non-executives, but that's not an end in of itself. In the work that we do, we find that you have non-executives who simply do not have the training or the educational programs to support what they should be doing in substance. So I'd really place a higher emphasis on the education and training programs that need to go into this. And also perhaps we should be asking ourselves a question, in countries where we have these structures already, why do we continue to see these failures? And so education should be targeted in those jurisdictions as well, despite the stronger structures that one might presume. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Right, we have 5 minutes. So I think the best thing is to hand over to Jeff and Carla for your sort of observations. If there are any other areas you want to tease out from us, please do so. Obviously, we will have breakout groups later, and I'm sure these conversations will continue. Anyway, I'm sure we will have more discussions with the sort of standard setting board on this topic as you move your work forward. So over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Alan. If we can move to the last slide, but whilst we're doing that, just some quick reactions. Perhaps starting with George's last point. I won't go through everybody, of course, we don't have that much time, but I guess as a start, thank you so much for all your feedback, and we will take those into consideration as we move into the December board meeting. We do recognize, of course, a lot of these systems are in place. In fact, all these systems are in place, and that's not what we are proposing. But what we are proposing is the importance of making sure that these systems, and starting from oversight and governance, prioritizes ethical values. Of course, perhaps this is some of the importance of transparency and accountability. There are quite a few comments about conflicts of interest, particularly from an audit perspective. A few comments about principles versus being too prescriptive. And I guess one of the points, perhaps as an example, because of course we didn't have a chance to get into the details of what the working group is recommending. For instance, if you look at education and training, and there were some comments about the importance of that as well. As a principle-based, perhaps standard, one of the things that we're looking at, in addition to what kind of principles you should have, and perhaps that they can go into a guidance material, and we can talk more freely about that, and that's, you can be prescriptive because it's not part of the standard. But in the standard itself, for instance, then the working group has been looking at, well, the ultimate goal is really not just to teach them and give them knowledge of what the code should be, and then they can recite it backwards, or they know how to deal with the different scenarios. But the goal needs to train staff, or perhaps indeed the INEs, with the mindset that will always put ethics as a priority, with a mindset that will always have an ethical consideration when they're making decisions, when they are taking actions. So I think that is along the lines of what we're looking at. And of course, some of the members have identified the importance of scalability. and some of points about, whether it's big firms, smaller firms, and whether we should limit it to those those firms that do PI audits. And this is something that the project team or NIXG, the ISBA will look at as we move to the next phase. And of course, a few comments about the ecosystems and the role of regulators. And of course, we work very closely with regulators, at the global level and as much as we can at the local level as well. And very much agree that, all our standards, we do need support from the regulatory committees. So that's something that we will look at as we move forward. So I know we don't have a lot of time, a couple of minutes, so perhaps just if I could just go through the next steps. At the December board meeting, the working group will present the final report, including the recommendations and also a project proposal. For approval. And next year, we will be looking at starting with some global roundtables in Q1 and Q2. And we'll also release the working group's final reports. And I think certainly the interplay between the guidance material, the NAMs, and the standard setting projects is important. With the NAMs, we can produce a lot more material, but at the same time, the two work streams will kind of inform each other as well. So we'll be looking at that. But the first main thing is at the December meeting, we'll be looking to get the board's feedback and consideration of the final report, the project proposal, and then hopefully get the approval as well. So thank you very much for all your input this morning. It's very much well appreciated and well considered. And back to you, Alan, for the next part of this session.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeff, Carlo, and of course to all the others who are working hard behind the scenes, including the members of the board under your leadership, Gabriella, for the work you're doing. You've received some very positive feedback, some questions that you need to reflect on, obviously, because this is a very important but complex topic to address. But I think, the direction is right, and the purpose is what matters, what you're trying to address in order to raise the standards so that our profession continues to be seen as the profession to go to if you want to enhance sort of credibility, defend the public interest, and ensure that we have high standards of behavior and governance. So thank you very much for that. Right. So I'm sorry we can't take a break now because we have kept David waiting. So David, very good morning to you, and I really appreciate your flexibility in joining us from where you are. I did explain to my colleagues that I and probably a few others listened to your presentation that you made at the IFAC board meeting, and I thought and we thought it was important for you to just share that with us. I know IFAC's not taking a position one way or the other, but you're just sharing with us sort of the state of play as you see it. And of course, that will be food for thought as we then go into our breakout sessions afterwards. So a good morning to you, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Hello, everybody. Good morning to most of you. I think are in New York. I know there are some online as well. I have been online for the last 3 hours with members of our public policy and regulatory advisory group that are meeting in Paris today. So I really apologize that I couldn't be there in person with all of you. We just couldn't make the timing work to get my travel from home to the office today. But I will be in later today if any of you would like to catch up. So the intersection between the work of my team and the work of the standard setting boards of IFIA over the last few years has really been dominated by the topic of sustainability. So I'm kind of pleased that IFAC's work outside of the sustainability arena can also be of interest and support the work of the IAASB and IASBA. So thank you to Alan for your invitation to present, as you properly presented them, our preliminary findings, our initial findings on the topic of private equity investment. If you can allow me the wordplay, I'm going to say that perhaps private equity is a sustainability topic, not in the ESG sense of the phrase or of the word, but in terms of the long-term resiliency, viability, or sustainability of the accountancy profession. I think that's one of the key questions underlying our examination of the role of private equity capital being into the profession and how we as a profession manage this evolution that seems to be taking place. So the work that we've done over the past 4 months has had 3 objectives. First was to understand the extent to which organizations that manage private equity capital are investing in accountancy firms. We then wanted to develop an appreciation for why this is happening, both from the perspective of the PE investor as well as the motivations of the accountancy firms that are entering into these transactions. And then finally, we wanted to identify some of the potential implications, if any, for the profession with PE as a meaningful partner in accountancy firms, both big and small firms. So we should also consider any future steps that IFAC can take as a voice or advocate for the global accountancy profession. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so highlighting the most important points from our analysis and try to help set the scene for the discussions that I know you're going to have following. So for context, I hope that many of you may be familiar with the state of play in sustainability reporting and assurance that IFAC does in partnership each year with AICPA CIMA. This has kind of become part of our DNA at IFAC. So we started this project on private equity by using our research expertise to gather some data as the basis for then beginning to analyze the possible implications of PE investment. So I need to take a second to acknowledge my colleague, Derek Coleman, who's online, also my colleague, Casey Gibbs, who are the ones that do this hard desktop research work. So on the next slide, let's take a look at some data. We see over the course of the next couple of slides that the UK and the US are the primary, but not the only markets for PE investment activity. It is a global phenomenon. The bar chart at the right shows that overall PE investment is concentrated in North America, Europe, which includes the UK, as second, and this is all PE, not just accountancy firm investment holdings. The timeline on this slide shows US and UK transaction activity amongst the 100 largest US and 100 largest UK firms. So PE investment is not new, but it has definitely increased in frequency, especially over the last 2 or 3 years. So note the volume of activity represented by those bars since the Cooper Perry transaction in July of 2022. A 60% stake in Grant Thornton in 2023 and continued activity around further consolidation with Grant Thornton Ireland and possibly Grant Thornton UK this year has really served as a headline that has brought these transactions to the forefront of many more PE investment organizations, to the attention of regulators and thought leaders in our profession. Certainly, as we've reached out over the last few months to our colleagues at Accountancy Europe, and I want to especially thank Accountancy Europe, but ACCA and AICPA and ICAW, as well as some form of firm members and others, PE investment is top of mind for everybody. In terms of the methodology we employed, a good starting point is to try to find a list of the largest firms in a specific jurisdiction and then data search for announcement with respect to those firms. And this is how we identified the US and the UK transactions on that graph. But anecdotal information, for example, about an organization called PIA, Partners in Accountancy in Belgium, led us to identify many, many more smaller transactions. In total, as of last week, when we prepared these slides, we have identified 256 private equity transactions. That's 116 more than the 140 that Alan will remember I reported to IFAC's board in September. So half of that difference has been brand new transactions since early September. And the other half has just been a result of our enhanced search capabilities. I think Derek gets up every morning and tries to find another PE transaction. And in most cases, he's successful, if not finding more than a couple. If there's a bias or error in our data, we think it's that we are still undercounting PE investment activity. So the data on the next slide gives us further evidence that this is an emerging and a significant market trend. Close to 60 transactions in the UK, over 70 in the US, more than 20 in Belgium and in the Netherlands and in Sweden, and a smaller number in Australia, Ireland, France, and Germany. We've not yet identified any to date in Africa or Asia, but perhaps that's just more research that we have to do. So the next two slides provide some interesting insight into a somewhat bifurcated market for PE investment in the profession. So here we're looking at the top 100 US firms. We see 2 former firm members, Grant Thornton and Baker Tilly, and then 13 other firms that have taken PE capital of significantly smaller size. So if we measure it by revenue, basically at the 500 million revenue mark and lower. So each bar represents one of the top 100 organizations. The red bars indicate where private equity capital has been invested. So if we switch to the UK, the same is true. We highlight more UK. But really, activity is happening at or below the 250 million revenue mark for PE investment in UK accountancy firms. Of the 256 total transactions we've identified, only 11% provide assurance services to public interest entity clients. About half, 48%, provide assurance to non-PI clients, and 41% do not provide assurance, but are practices offering bookkeeping, tax, consulting, and other services. And I think we need to keep in mind this bifurcation in where PE capital is being invested by revenue or size of firm and by type of services as we consider the possible implications of PE investment. All right, on the next couple of slides, we'll provide some background about the PE industry so we can better understand the size, the diversity, the operating model for these investment organizations. PE assets under management total 14 trillion in 2023. So to put that number into perspective, that's half the size of the market cap of the NYSE, but it's twice the size of the stock markets in Shanghai, Europe, and Japan. So it is a significant amount. There are some PE names on this slide that I think most of you will recognize. The top 10 PE organizations each have at least 50 billion assets under management. To be in the top 300, a PE firm is at least 2.3 billion in assets under management. So it's a diverse, long list of investment organizations. And we've identified 55 different PE organizations that have invested in the 256 transactions that we've identified so far. So taking a look at business model, what are these asset managers doing with their $14 trillion? They do not focus on publicly traded stocks or bonds, but typically purchase entire companies or majority controlling stakes in companies. The objective is to improve operating efficiency, increase scale, and drive growth. I want to emphasize efficiency, scale, and growth are the 3 important things. And by focusing on those, they hope to improve the secondary market value of the company that they've invested in. PE investors need a takeout strategy, be it an initial public offering of stock to take the company public, or when that's not really a viable option, probably isn't in the accountancy profession, there's a partial or total sale of their initial investment to one or more other PE investment funds or some other type of private investor. One industry tracker we found calculated the average investment hold period at just under 6 years. All right, so on the next slide, next couple of slides, we'll take a look at why invest in accountancy firms. So PE investors like entities and industry sectors that are perceived to be in need of improvements in how they're managed and operated. They like fragmented industries where there are opportunities for consolidation or other ways to build economies of scale. They like steady cash flows, like an annuity stream from annual audit fees that can provide a somewhat reliable return to investors during the holding period, and they can also be used to fund growth, for example, growth through acquisition of other firms. So again, it's about efficiency, scale, and growth, and then the sale. Dutch investor Waterland mentions economies of scale and growth in describing their investment in More Netherlands, following investments in More Belgium and More Ireland. So all of this said, I can say from my personal experience working in financial services that there are differences between PE firms. Some being highly involved in the day-to-day operations of their portfolio companies, and others being more passive, acting more like independent board directors or venture capitalists rather than fixers. All right, so now let's turn to what are the opportunities and drivers for accountancy firms. So first, new capital can drive the type of practice transformation that we all talk about in the profession to create resilient, sustainable firms that are technology enabled and future fit, especially outside of the Big Four or the Big 4+2. PE managers can bring needed expertise in cost savings, offshoring, other efficiencies. New technology, hiring and retaining talent, and expanding client advisory offerings is expensive. The CEO of Citrin Cooperman, they used to be located on the 5th floor, right adjacent to where you're sitting in the boardroom today, highlights the technology point in this quote that's on the slide. PE capital can drive diversification and expansion for a firm, both in terms of the services offered and their geographic presence. PE capital can fuel growth through M&A. And retirement obligations of accountancy firm partnerships can be a financial drag on needed investments to drive growth, which is not to ignore the potential value of providing liquidity to retiring partners and creating incentives for rising and junior partners. I remember a conversation with one former firm member who spoke passionately and positively about the roles and benefits of private equity, like I've just described, for their firm. So one more element we should focus on before turning to potential implications of private equity investment is transaction structure. In the UK, EU, US, as many of you know, and elsewhere, there are limitations that require a firm partnership that engages in assurance services to be majority owned by professional accountants. So when PE invests, transaction structure becomes important. So we highlight 4 different structures on this slide. First, separating assurance from advisory. Advisory services are incorporated into a separate legal entity. Let's call it an LLC. The assurance services remain in the conventional partnership, an LLP. A service agreement facilitates personnel and services from the LLC to the LLP, with LLP profits consolidated back in the LLC. Where there is a majority stake taken in a firm, we pretty much suspect that this type of separation is happening in most cases, but it's not always disclosed information. Our understanding of New Mountain Capital's 60% stake in Grant Thornton follows this approach, and it would facilitate U.S. Grant Thornton Advisory combining with Ireland Grant Thornton Advisory, as well as ongoing discussions about combining UK Grant Thornton Advisory. And it's the same for Cherry Beckert, which is featured in the quote on the slide. So growth through acquisition, the second one. Waterland is an example of how infusing capital into one accountancy firm can empower subsequent acquisitions by that firm. Another is Citrin Cooperman, which has made 9 acquisitions since receiving capital from New Mountain. Revenues increased over 40% for Citrin Cooperman between 2022 and 2023 as a result of subsequent acquisition. Eisner Amper recently reported, or is reported to have made 14 acquisitions since receiving PE investment, with their revenue rising over 70% from 2021 to 2023. So next is a network or the roll-up model. This is really another form of growth through acquisition, but we single it out because the PE investor takes a more hands-off approach, allowing the recipients of the capital to remain effectively independent. So a primary example of this is a firm that takes this approach, a PE firm that takes this approach is Baltese, which is invested in PIA, I mentioned that earlier, Partners in Accountancy, which is a force in the Benelux countries. So apparently PI offers firms the flexibility to keep their own name and identity, respecting the DNA, as one PI firm was quoted in the press, while gaining access to benefits and enhancements like technology. And then finally, we included direct lending, and perhaps this is a bit of a unique example, but BDO is a GPP firm, so we thought it was important to highlight that private equity investors are also expanding into private credit markets, meaning that they're doing commercial lending outside of the conventional banking system. So in the BDO example, Apollo Management lent $1.3 billion to fund BDO's 2023 Employee Stock Option Plan, or ESOP. And that gives employees an ownership stake in the form of shares, and they often vest over time. All right, so now we'll finally turn to some implications and unanswered questions. So media coverage and some regulatory commentary has been cautious, if not negative, and you can note the words of caution regarding independence from the US SEC staff. But our analysis and our conversations have also highlighted that there are benefits. And that's highlighted by the CEO of Baker Tilly in the quote on the slide with respect to technology. So based on our research and our discussion so far, we've come up with 5 key areas to consider. Public interest. Firms need capital to innovate, grow, and prosper. This allows them to continue to fulfill their public interest responsibility in dealing with increasingly complex clients and issues. Subject to profit motives overtaking audit quality and public interest priorities. Culture, governance, audit quality. PE managers are sometimes called fixers, as I refer to them, can improve operational efficiency through offshoring, technology, better cash management. This is all good management practice. But can firm culture and direct PE involvement in the day-to-day operational decisions change firm culture, possibly impacting the assurance side of the business and put audit quality at risk? Consolidation and competition. PE investment may incentivize consolidation amongst mid-tier and smaller practices. So you get larger, better resourced, and more resilient accounting practices. This can even address concerns about market concentration in some jurisdictions. But could too much consolidation reduce incentives to compete over quality, as well as reduce the profession's ability to meet demand for high-quality financial audit, let alone sustainability assurance in some jurisdictions? Independence and the multidisciplinary firm model. Are there limitations to today's partnership model, simply placing too many restrictions on advisory business, so we need to separate assurance from advisory? Or, over the long term, will consolidation, expanding advisory clients, and the relationship between firms and other PE portfolio companies ultimately lead to even more conflicts and independent risks, be they real or perceived? And then reputation. Wouldn't any smart PE investor recognize and work to maintain and enhance the value of a firm's name and brand, especially from an assurance perspective? But can association with PE create a perception issue that can damage a firm's identity? So, final slide. We think there are 2 sides to most of these issues. And we're in the relatively early stages of PE investment in our profession. So our analysis of the potential implications is inconclusive, but we're trying to proceed with our work in this area, taking a balanced approach. Time will tell us if the positive effects we've just reviewed will prevail. Regulatory review will tell us if audit quality is being impacted. We need to understand how PE will realize gains and exit or reduce their firm investments. And we need to better understand if firms have found the right match in their PE partner and whether those positive relationships will hold up over time. As a profession, we ultimately have our own responsibility to manage this evolution. So what are some next steps? The most consistent feedback that we've received so far is that the profession could benefit from a common understanding of and the role and implications of PE investment, and that it might be useful to advance its own narrative rather than allow this evolution to be defined by the media. On the right-hand side are some next possible steps, if and how IFAC can play a role in monitoring, understanding and advising advising on this emerging trend. So we will continue to do our research. We are establishing a task force. We announced that at our PPRAG meeting this morning that we believe will help us facilitate engagement, help us better monitor transaction flow on a global basis, and better begin to continue to assess and understand these potential implications. So with that, I thank you for your attention and turn things back to you, Alan.
David, thank you very much. Really appreciate you sharing this excellent work you've done. There won't be any time for questions, and I know you've got to jump in the car and get into the office. But this was very valuable input to help us as we now break into, well, we'll take a break first and then go into sort of our breakout groups to consider the impact. And we've got a very diverse, the membership of SAC is very diverse. We've got regulators, investors, preparers, professional auditors, those charged with governance, etc. So I'm sure we'll have a very rich conversation, probably some conflicting thoughts from different perspectives, which is healthy because that's what we need. In my view, we need to keep an open mind. And as you said, we need to look at the risks, the opportunities, the benefits, and of course, what the potential downsides might be. But at this stage, my encouragement to everyone will be, to keep an open mind. As David has shown us, the pace is rapid from 140 to 156 in less than 3 months. And no doubt that will continue. So the train is moving along the tracks, and our task and responsibility to say, what does it mean and what should we be thinking of in the two standard setting boards to ensure that the train stays on the rails and doesn't end up in a bad smash down the line. So with that, David, on behalf of my colleagues on the SAC and of course the standard setting board members, those present and of course those who aren't, and all the staff who are working on these projects, we thank you very much for your time and good luck with your ongoing work. And as you said, you'll be discussing this in the IFAC board, I think, which is on Friday in Paris. So I'm sure there are lots of different views across a board of 22 as well, as there will be across this SAC group. So thank you, David. Have a good day and safe travels into the office.
Thank you, Alan.
If there's time, I might catch a cup of coffee at your expense later on. Thanks. Okay, so with that, what I suggest is well, Linda, do you want to give us some instructions? Maybe it's better coming from you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Ellen, that would be great. So actually, all of the breakout rooms are upstairs. Even for the virtual people, you're going to be joining virtually. But for the group 1, you'll be in the orange room. For group 2, you'll be in the green room. So if you can make your way up there, we'll get started. I think we're going to reconvene for lunch at noon. Is that correct? That's what I'm hearing. So the breakout sessions should be completed by noon. So you can come down, have your lunch for about 30 minutes, and then we'll report back to the group at 12:30 after lunch, kind of what the different groups have said. So thank you.
May I maybe
Yes.
Agreed with that,
Yeah.
but let's be flexible because I
Sure.
suspect we might need more than an hour
Okay,
to discuss
good.
this. In which case, those who want to continue, just come down, grab the lunch and take it back upstairs and continue.
Great. Thank you, Alan.
Because, we don't have the opportunity to be together in small groups, a rich discussion. So let's not curtail it by breaking, coming back downstairs.
That's perfect.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so upstairs, and there'll be colleagues upstairs guiding people who don't know where the rooms are, the green and the orange. Thanks.